It can get really dark at night. We sometimes forget that, since we live in a world filled with electricity. But head out to one of the dark sky locations just over in West Virginia, and you can realize just how dark it really can get. Now, imagine a world always that dark at night without any artificial light, where the only thing you really can see are the stars. And you can start to imagine why ancient people paid so much attention to the stars. They wanted to understand what was going on in that starry expanse. And when something unexpected happened up there, well, it makes sense that wise men would seek answers. It can get really dark at night, and so the light of the star guided them. I wonder sometimes why they felt so compelled to make such a long, arduous journey. What they felt was missing in their life, what they thought they would find. Well, the star GPS got them safely to Judea, but they had to figure out the last few miles for themselves. So they went to Jerusalem, and really, why wouldn't they? It was the center of power, the home of the king, the concentration of all the learned, the wealthy, the religious. It seemed like a place that light would be shining. I wonder, did they know what they were doing when they went to talk to Herod? Did they have any idea what the implications of their visit would be? How could they have possibly known just how much darker the night would still get? And so they naively ask King Herod for directions. Where is the child who has been born king of the Jews? And Herod, who was crafty and sly, must have been practiced at keeping a straight face, because he must have hid his surprise there. For indeed, he had to have been surprised, because he was the king of the Jews, and he had spent his entire kingship making sure there were no threats to his rule. When he came to the throne, he had members of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of the Jewish people, executed. He thought nothing of killing members of his own family throughout his reign, including his own beloved wife, when he suspected them of scheming against him. And later on, as he himself was approaching death, he gave orders for the leading citizens of Jericho to be slaughtered when he died, so that there would be weeping at the time of his funeral. So he asked the Magi to just hold on 1 minute while he hastily assembled the religious leaders for a brief catechism lesson. Where again did they say the Messiah was to be born? And the religious leaders, well, they were frightened. Frightened by the king and what he'd do, to be sure. Perhaps also frightened that these outsiders were making claims about their sky. And maybe, if they were honest, frightened by the news that their world, which had probably grown to be pretty comfortable, could be completely upended if this claim was true. And so they give Herod the information he needs to meet this threat. In Bethlehem of Judea, they say, according to the prophet Micah, at least. So King Herod sends the Magi on their way. May as well use them for a bit of free reconnaissance, after all. 9 miles later, the Magi find the home. And they are overwhelmed with joy. They go in and they offer beautiful gifts, terribly unsuited for an infant. I mean, really, did no one think to grab like a rattle and a board book and some Pampers? But they give him what they have, including myrrh, which is a resin that at that time was used for embalming a corpse. Happy birthday, little boy. Here's a little something for your death. But I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves there. The Magi are warned in a dream not to return to Herod, and so their long, strange journey continues as they go home by another road into the dark night. I wonder what they thought about everything they had seen and heard. I wonder if their lives were changed in any way. I wonder what they told people once they got back. A dream also came to Joseph, warning him to take his family and escape, which he does just in time before the empire strikes back. Because when the world gets upended, the power of death is going to be wielded in the world by people who are afraid of losing their power. That's what people do. That's what happened then. It's what happens in our world now, too. And the innocent, the powerless, the children become mere political pawns in the hands of rulers drunk on their own power. It happened then. It happens now. This side of the Christmas story doesn't usually get told in our Christmas pageants, where kids in robes and crowns bow down before the baby Jesus. But it has to be told. It has to be held in tension with everything else we say this time of the year. We can't talk about the light of Christ without naming the terrible darkness. We have to acknowledge that associating with this child, Jesus, is dangerous. And this gospel story forces us to look at human sin and its violent effects on human beings. Rachel weeping, her children are no more. That statement is stark and confrontational to all those who call themselves God's children. Children are suffering, and it is up to us to act. How? Well, here is an example that I think is both startling and hopeful from a book by author Megan McKenna. She writes about Archbishop Ivan Marin Lopez of Popayan, Colombia, who speaks of his ministry in rural Colombia. He says, in order to reach some of the communities, one has to travel 20 hours by horse over narrow paths. There are other communities where life expectancy is only 35 years. In these poor, simple communities, the love of Christ works wonders, and people live in Christian fraternity with heroic deeds. 6 months ago, he writes, in an isolated community without any health care, a woman was expecting her first child. The midwife said that the baby could not be born. Its head was too big. In a few minutes, the alarm was raised. 20 young men were organized to carry her in relay for 6 hours to reach the closest clinic. They arrived in time. The physician intervened and saved the woman and the baby. And the people called the child the son of the community. The story is remarkable. The community of believers, those who are children of the light, together take care of one another to bring life. As church, we are called to look upon all children, but especially the poor and marginalized, as children of our community. In the sacrament of baptism, we are questioned whether or not we as a community of believers will aid those having their children brought forward in baptism and raising them and providing for them. We did it at 8:30 with Cameron Lynn, and the congregation assembled answered yes on behalf of all of us. We are not just families of believers or even an individual congregation. We are the church, the body of Christ, and we are called to be responsible for one another and resist the darkness wherever it is found. This is why we have so many ministries at Muhlenberg that focus on children. This is why Second Home matters, so that kids in our community have a safe place to be where they are loved and cared for. This is why the daycare that we host matters. This is why Faith in Action, who is working this year to try to expand access to childcare here in our community, which is so desperately needed, that's why we're involved with that, and that work matters. That's why our local global mission team sponsored the Minnick School project at Christmas time, so that we could walk with these kids who are so often overlooked to make sure they had a Christmas celebration at home. It's why we attend school board meetings. It's why we work for gun control advocacy. It's why we do the things we do that matter for kids. There are kids hurting, kids in darkness. We heard about another one this week in Newport News with the tragic shooting of a 6-year-old shooting a teacher. And I just read that that teacher is a graduate of JMU. We are all connected. We are the body of Christ, and when one part is hurting, we all hurt and must respond. I learned recently something curious. We see in a visual way, right here in the sanctuary, Muhlenberg's longtime commitment to this aspect of our ministry to children. Every week, when we look at the stained glass, you may or may not know this, but see the two little kids there at the bottom of the stained glass window? I always assumed they were cherubs or some sort of angelic figure. But it turns out, no, those were actually based on the grandchildren of the person who gave the money for that stained glass window. So, which is a pretty cool way to be memorialized, I must say. But we have actual children right here at this image of the resurrection scene here in our sanctuary. Every week we're reminded of that call that children need to be given resurrection life. And so I guess the challenge for us as individuals is to not just be glad that we're part of a congregation that cares about kids, but to actually take time, each and every one of us, to find a way to be a part of those ministries. Ashley does an amazing job with our children's ministry. Pastor Alex is doing amazing things to grow our youth ministry. Our local global mission team has amazing projects to help kids, but they can't do it alone. It takes all of us, the body of Christ, to contribute, to make this stuff happen because it matters. We, body of Christ, we are invited to travel with those Magi, travel those 9 miles from power and privilege and comfort to a place of vulnerability and sacrifice, and maybe even some disruption from the status quo. And then we're called to go home by a different way, changed by our encounter with the living Lord. That may involve confronting Herod and saying, we're not going to let you kill our kids anymore. Or it might mean being silent and listening to the stories of kids and parents in our community who are struggling. It can get really dark in our world, yes, but we are not left in darkness. We're given hope here in the gospel when the words of the prophet are quoted, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." We're reminded the people were called out of Egypt into freedom, to dignity, to a relationship with God. They were called to life in all its abundance. That light and life has been born into our world in Jesus. In the face of evil and violence, let us stand in solidarity with the one who came to this earth to save and redeem us all. Let us carry that light which scatters the darkness. Let us go home by a different road. And let us live in the love and promise of Christ. Amen.